She spoke 9 languages fluently, but for years, no one really heard her. Imani Reeves was just another uniformed face in the crowded aisles of an international airline, calm, composed, invisible. That is, until one turbulent flight changed everything. Why did the CEO of a billion-dollar airline suddenly walk into coach and ask to sit next to her? Why did a single act of kindness spoken in languages most passengers didn't even understand cause the internet to explode? And what did one tired flight attendant do that sparked a corporate transformation and shattered decades of quiet discrimination from 36,000 feet above the ground? This isn't just a story about a woman who spoke many tongues. It's about the power of being seen, the cost of silence, and the ripple effect of empathy when it finally finds a microphone. Before we dive into this moving story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe because stories like these need to be heard, far and wide. Now, buckle up. You're not ready for what happens next. Let's begin. The early morning sun had just begun to creep across the tarmac at JFK International Airport. Terminal 4 buzzed with tired families, business travelers in pressed suits, and solo wanderers gripping coffee like it was life support. Among the organized chaos, Imani Reeves stood by gate C-19, her uniform perfectly pressed, her curls tied back in a neat bun, calm, poised, quiet, but not unnoticed. Flight AV-197 to Lisbon was boarding in just under 40 minutes, and already the first hints of tension were in the air. There always were, especially on international flights. Cultural misunderstandings, language barriers, expectations as high as the altitude they'd soon reach. Imani had learned to breathe through it all. As passengers began lining up for early boarding, she stood just behind the gate agent, assisting an elderly Portuguese couple trying to locate their assigned seats. Without hesitation, she shifted from English to fluent Portuguese, offering directions with a smile that came more from instinct than training. The couple beamed. The gate agent blinked. "You speak Portuguese?" he whispered, half impressed, half incredulous. Imani nodded softly. Among others, she didn't offer more, because every time she said, "I speak 9 languages," the room either went silent or, worse, suspicious. A young flight attendant approached, her badge reading Lee Carson. She glanced at Imani's neat appearance with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I see we're already showing off," Carson muttered, loud enough to be heard. Imani turned her gaze toward her, voice steady but kind, just helping where help was needed. Before Carson could respond, the gate agent called, "Priority boarding for flight AV-197 to Lisbon." Imani exhaled quietly and stepped forward to welcome the passengers. This was her role, her moment, not for recognition, but for service, though lately. She wondered if service only meant enduring without a voice. By the time the cabin doors closed, the first signs of trouble had already appeared. A woman in her 60s, later identified as Elaine Voss, founder of a Manhattan-based art brokerage, had made it quite clear she did not want the black one handling her coat in first class. "I'd rather hang it myself." Elaine had sniffed, holding her designer cashmere shawl like it might get stained by proximity. Imani didn't flinch. She stepped back, offered a nod, and turned to the next passenger. But inside, she felt the familiar chill, that strange silence of being erased in plain sight. In coach, the air felt different, tighter. She moved quietly through the aisles, assisting with bags, giving a shy toddler a sticker shaped like a butterfly. Her badge shimmered slightly under the dimmed lights. Reeves, Imani, lead cabin crew, near the back. She reached row 34A, where a man was adjusting his laptop bag under the seat. His salt and pepper hair was unkempt, his jeans worn but clean. He looked like a literature professor or a lost backpacker on sabbatical. His boarding pass said E. "Cole, good morning, sir." She greeted, "Anything I can help you with before takeoff?" He looked up, surprised by the warm cadence of her voice, not overly chipper, not robotic. Real. "Actually, yes," he said, nodding toward his bag. "Would it be okay if I kept this under my feet? I've got some notes I may want to check mid-flight." She gave a slight smile. "Perfectly fine. Mr. Cole, just make sure the aisle stays clear." He tilted his head. "You've got an ear for language, don't you?" Imani raised an eyebrow. Subtly. "How do you mean?" He gestured vaguely. "Your tone, it carries intention, like someone who knows more than one way to say something." For a second, Imani considered brushing it off, but something about his observation felt intentional. So she simply replied, "Languages matter. They can open doors or close them." He gave a small nod and settled into his seat. She moved on. Back in the galley, Carson was whispering to another attendant. Lena, loud enough for Imani to catch snippets. "It's not a talent. She's just trying to stand out, always overperforming." Imani closed her eyes for a second. She could have said something, but she didn't. Not yet. Not today. Instead, she pulled out her checklist and began the final cabin prep, one row at a time, one culture at a time, one moment of patience after another. That was how she'd built a career in the sky, not just because she spoke multiple languages, but because she knew how to read the room when the air got thin. As the plane began to taxi, the engines humming louder, the cabin lights dimmed. She looked over the passengers one more time, fingers brushing the edge of the seat backs, eyes soft but alert. And at row 34A, Mr. Cole watched her not with suspicion, not with pity, but with interest. Something about her told him there was more to this story, and he was right. The skies above the Atlantic were about to shift, and Imani Reeves, quiet, calm, and infinitely capable, was about to be tested in every language of the human heart. The seatbelt sign pinged softly overhead. A soft tremor of turbulence made the ice in glasses clink like nervous laughter. Imani Reeves walked slowly down the aisle, checking that everyone was settled. A toddler fussed 2 rows up. A quick distraction with a mini coloring book calmed him. The mother mouthed, "Thank you," and Imani simply smiled. It was always in the details, the quiet work. The stuff no one applauded but everyone expected. From behind her came a faint whisper. "Didn't know the help came multilingual these days," someone muttered. Imani paused mid-step. She didn't turn. She didn't even blink. But her breath caught. It was a voice from row 3 first class, Elaine Voss. The woman had been glancing back toward Imani every few minutes. Her expression tight and judging, like she expected Imani to drop a tray or mispronounce champagne. "Now." The remark had floated just loud enough for the neighboring passengers to hear, just quiet enough for plausible deniability. Carson Lee, the senior flight attendant, stood nearby. She heard it, too. Imani looked over. Carson's expression blank. Not a single muscle moved. Not a raised brow. Not a supportive glance. Just air. It had always been like this silence from the ones in power when power spoke cruelty in velvet tones. Back in the galley, Imani leaned against the silver counter, fingers resting beside a row of espresso pods. Carson walked in and said, too lightly, "You okay?" Imani looked up, voice low and even. "I'm fine. You know," Carson continued, opening a cabinet. "I'm sure Elaine didn't mean it. That generation, they're not trying to be offensive. They just have their way." Imani met her gaze, calm. "It's not the first time someone had their way at my expense." Carson chuckled softly. "Well, maybe just don't take it personally. Keep it professional. Right?" The insult slid from Carson's mouth like a policy memo, polite, cold, institutional. A few hours into the flight, tension began to simmer in the cabin. A misunderstanding in row 16, a German couple had received the wrong meal. They didn't speak English well and were growing frustrated. Lena, the junior attendant, fumbled awkwardly with Google Translate. Passengers nearby turned their heads, murmuring. Then Imani stepped in. "Entschuldigen Sie die Verwirrung," she said, gently kneeling. "I apologize for the confusion." The couple's faces lit up with relief. She continued, explaining the options, making a quick apology for the mix-up, even offering an extra dessert. Carson appeared behind her just in time to hear the end of the exchange. Her jaw tightened. "Nice of you to step in," she said, too sweetly. Imani smiled without turning, just helping where help was needed. Carson paused. "You seem to know every language on this plane. Lucky us." Imani turned now, her eyes calm but unflinching. "It's not luck, it's work." For a heartbeat, the air was razor-thin between them. Far back in row 34A, Ethan Cole closed his notebook. He had seen the entire thing, watched Carson's posture, watched Imani take the blow and respond with grace, not silence. The cabin had returned to its rhythm, but a story was unfolding in plain sight, and Ethan knew it was time to dig deeper. He turned to a passing crew member. "Excuse me, could you send Ms. Reeves to me when she has a moment?" Lena blinked. "Sure, of course." When Imani arrived, he greeted her warmly. "I just wanted to say, I saw how you handled that situation earlier. The German passengers, that takes presence. Grace," she hesitated, a little guarded. Compliments usually came with strings. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "And I noticed earlier Portuguese, now German. Are you trained in languages?" A small smile tugged at her mouth. "I studied linguistics before joining the airline. I've picked up a few more since then." "How many?" She met his eyes. 9. He blinked. "That's extraordinary." She shrugged gently. "Sometimes it's easier to speak to people in their language than try to explain why mine isn't enough." Ethan's eyes softened. She didn't know who he was, and for now he liked it that way. Back in the galley, Carson watched Imani return from the back of the plane with a barely hidden look of irritation. "She's always got someone wrapped around her finger," she said to Lena. "Don't be fooled." But Carson wasn't angry at Imani's work. She was angry at her ease. Angry that someone like her, soft-spoken, dark-skinned, unassuming, could somehow command loyalty just by being kind and competent. It unsettled her, and she wasn't the only one. The higher they flew, the sharper the tension would become. Altitude 38,000 feet, location somewhere over the mid-Atlantic. The hum of the engines served as background music for a cabin that had mostly settled into a drowsy rhythm. But underneath the surface, behind polite nods and tired glances, small frictions were beginning to crackle. In row 22, a man in a navy blazer, Robert Dresden, a mid-level diplomat on his way to a trade summit, was speaking sharply to a young Moroccan woman seated beside him. Her name was Lena Bari, and her English was minimal. Imani noticed the rising tone before she saw the source. "I'm just asking you to stop leaning into my space," Dresden snapped. "Do you understand?" Lena Bari looked confused. She mumbled something, then shrank back in her seat. From behind them, a woman watching shook her head and muttered, "Always playing dumb." Imani stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir. Is everything all right here?" she asked gently. Robert Dresden rolled his eyes. "She's invading my personal space. I've asked her 3 times. She's pretending not to understand." Imani turned to Lena Bari and switched seamlessly into Arabic. "هل كل شيء على ما يرام؟ هل يمكنك شرح ما حدث? Is everything all right? Can you explain what happened?" Lena Bari's eyes widened first in surprise, then relief. She explained quietly that she'd simply shifted in her seat while trying to avoid her tray knocking over and didn't mean to bother anyone. Imani nodded, then turned to Dresden. "She wasn't trying to disturb you, just adjusting to get comfortable." Dresden narrowed his eyes. "You speak Arabic now." Imani didn't blink. "Yes," he huffed. "Well, that's convenient." A few passengers around them had begun listening now. Imani could feel the weight of their gazes, some admiring, others disbelieving. Suspicion always followed excellence that didn't look like what people expected. Later in the galley, Carson once again stirred the pot. Arabic too. "Really?" she asked Lena, her tone sugary. "That's 4 languages today. It's almost like she's performing." Lena didn't answer, but Carson wasn't done. She pulled out a small complaint slip from her apron. "Also, we just got this." She handed it to Imani. "Passenger complaint, gate C-19 unsettled by one flight attendant, constantly switching languages. Unclear if this is a security issue. Felt uncomfortable. Prefer uniform communication." Imani stared at the note. A knot formed in her chest, not of fear, but of deep, familiar disappointment. To some, her gift was always a threat if they couldn't understand it. Not celebration, but suspicion. "I wasn't being unprofessional," she said, voice firm. Carson shrugged. "I'm just saying. Maybe tone it down a little. It's not about showing off." Imani folded the complaint slip neatly and slid it into her pocket. "It's never about showing off. It's about showing up." Carson said nothing, but her glare lingered. Meanwhile, in row 34A, Ethan Cole was quietly observant again. He saw the tension, even from far back. Watched how the crew members shifted around Imani like gravity was tilting the plane. He reached for his iPad, opened a secure Astra VIA internal document, and began typing. Subject unannounced cabin review. Flight AV-197 notes. Flight lead. Imani Reeves shows exceptional linguistic versatility and emotional intelligence. Hostility from colleague Lee. Carson bordering on targeted undermining. Potential culture of masked hostility within crew. Recommend formal review. Next, observe passenger reactions. Monitor incident escalation. He hit save, but not send. Not yet. He wanted to see more. Later in the flight, as drinks were being served, Carson accidentally skipped row 16, the German couple from earlier. Imani noticed, quietly. She grabbed a tray and walked over. "Entschuldigen Sie, möchten Sie Wasser oder Saft?" "Excuse me, would you like water or juice?" The wife smiled gratefully. "Wasser. Bitte." Carson saw it all. She pulled Lena aside. "This is getting out of hand," she hissed. "She's undermining the entire structure. You don't just go rogue and do everyone's job." Lena looked unsure. "She's just helping," Carson snapped. "She's not the hero. This isn't a language contest. If anyone should be leading this crew, it's someone who knows how to follow protocol, not steal the spotlight." The words landed like spit on stone. Lena didn't respond, but Imani, having overheard from the galley's edge, felt the air shift. She had stayed silent long enough. That night, the skies outside were black velvet, speckled with stars. The plane glided forward into nothingness, and inside things were about to explode. But not yet. The real confrontation was still ahead, one that would not only expose prejudice in the skies, but force the CEO watching quietly from the back to make a choice. And what he would do would shock everyone on board. The lights in the cabin dimmed as passengers eased into the second half of the transatlantic journey. Some wrapped themselves in the thin airline blankets. Others, flickering screens reflecting on tired faces, scrolled through in-flight movies or dozed in restless silence. In the back galley, Imani stood alone, the soft hum of the plane her only company. She had been through worse, but this slow, creeping undermining in front of passengers, behind curtains, under the guise of protocol, was beginning to feel like something deeper. She took a deep breath, leaning slightly on the service cart. Her fingers brushed the folded complaint slip still tucked in her apron pocket. It crinkled, a reminder. Unsettled by one flight attendant constantly switching languages, not by her voice, but by her ability. Then came the call chime. Seat 3A, first class, Elaine Voss. Imani steadied herself and walked up the aisle. Elaine didn't look up from her tablet as she spoke. "I asked for mint tea nearly 20 minutes ago." Imani kept her voice calm. "Yes, ma'am. I was assisting other passengers in the rear cabin. I can bring that right now." Elaine gave a tight smile. "You know, it's charming how you try to do it all, but I'd appreciate a little efficiency instead of theatrics." Imani paused. Theatrics. Elaine glanced at her, lips pressed. "You know what I mean." Behind them, a young man in 2B shifted uncomfortably. He had overheard and it showed on his face. Imani turned away. "I'll bring your tea shortly." In the galley, Carson was waiting. "Problems up front?" Imani didn't answer. Carson reached over and picked up a tea bag. "Want me to take care of it? She seems to like a certain kind of help." Imani's response was soft but firm. "No, I've got it," Carson scoffed. "You're really taking this superwoman thing seriously." Imani turned to her now. "I'm doing my job. Carson, all of it. Every seat, every language, every passenger, and making the rest of us look like amateurs in the process." Carson shot back. Imani stepped forward, voice still level, but her eyes, for the first time, flared with something sharp. "Maybe it's not me making you look that way." Lena, who had walked into the galley to restock napkins, froze. Silence, thick, electric. Then the curtain snapped open. It was Ethan Cole. "I'd like to speak with you, Ms. Reeves," he said calmly. Carson opened her mouth to object, but he cut her off without even looking. "Alone, please." They stepped into the narrow hallway near the rear exit door, away from ears. "I hope I'm not overstepping," Ethan began, "but I've observed several troubling dynamics on this flight." Imani didn't answer right away. "Finally," she said, "you're not the only one." He nodded, then paused. "Ms. Reeves, do you know who I am?" She studied him. "Not exactly, but I have my guesses." He smiled faintly. "Ethan Cole, CEO of Astravia." Her expression didn't change. He added, "You've been exceptional, not just with passengers, but under pressure that, frankly, should never exist on a professional crew." Imani finally let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Thank you, but I'm not looking for praise. I'm looking for change." Ethan nodded. "That's why I'm here. Unannounced review. And now, I've seen enough." Back in the front of the plane, Carson was pacing in the galley. She could feel the shift. The atmosphere had changed subtly, like a storm about to break. Lena entered with fresh coffee. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Carson turned, suddenly sharp. "She's manipulating everyone. Even that guy in 34A, she's got him eaten out of her hand." Lena looked down. "He's the CEO." Carson froze. "What?" "He's the CEO of the airline," Lena repeated, quieter. "Mr. Cole, I just confirmed with the captain." Carson's face went pale, a beat of pure suffocating silence. Then she stormed out. Imani returned to first class with Elaine's tea. She placed it gently on the tray. Elaine looked at her with that same smug smile. "Thank you, dear." Imani straightened. "I speak 9 languages. Ms. Voss, I've trained harder than most in this industry. Not to be called dear or treated like your personal assistant, but to make every passenger, regardless of who they are, feel seen, safe, human." Elaine blinked, stunned. "And I'll keep doing that, whether or not it unsettles you." With that, she turned and walked back down the aisle. Halfway through the cabin, light applause broke out from a few passengers. Not loud, but loud enough. At the very rear, Ethan Cole stood watching. A small smile played at the corner of his lips. The confrontation had begun, but the real reckoning that was still to come, and this time it wouldn't be whispered. The sun had begun to stretch across the clouds as Flight AV-197 soared over the Atlantic. Below, a sea of cotton drifted in silence, but inside the cabin, the tension was louder than ever. Captain Rowan Hale sat stiffly in the cockpit, sipping lukewarm coffee. He was a veteran of the skies, but today he had the distinct sense that something unusual was unfolding and that it was making its way to his door. There was a soft knock on the cockpit door. "Captain," came a voice, calm, measured, unshaken. It was Ethan Cole. Rowan opened the door and turned in his seat. Yes, Sir Ethan stepped in, ducking slightly under the low frame. "I'd like a moment of your time. Privately." The co-pilot glanced at Rowan, unsure. Rowan nodded once. "It's all right, Davis." When the door shut again, Ethan didn't waste time. "I need to ask you something. Captain Hale, are you aware of the ongoing interpersonal breakdowns within your cabin crew?" Rowan bristled. "We've had no safety issues reported, no passenger injuries, just a few service complaints." Ethan's eyes locked on him. "It's not about physical safety. It's about cultural climate, internal sabotage, passive discrimination, and a flight culture that allows a top-performing employee who speaks 9 languages and carries more emotional weight than 3 of your senior crew combined to be undermined." Rowan's mouth opened, then shut. He wasn't used to passengers talking this way. Certainly not in the cockpit, and especially not passengers with a tone like they owned the sky. Ethan continued. "Do you know who I am?" Rowan swallowed. "I've heard. Then you know I'm not asking these questions idly. Meanwhile, in the galley, Carson had begun to unravel. She kept rearranging cups, opening drawers, fidgeting with the inventory list, anything to avoid Lena's quiet stares. Finally, she spoke. This is ridiculous. So she speaks languages. So what? That doesn't mean she's some kind of saint. I've flown for 15 years. I've earned my position. Lena spoke softly. No one said you hadn't, Carson snapped. Then why is everyone acting like she's untouchable? Like we should all bow to Imani, the multilingual queen? Lena hesitated because she never asked for a crown. She just does her job and does it well. Carson went silent, but her silence didn't bring peace. It only deepened the war within her. In the rear, Imani stood at the emergency exit, looking out the tiny porthole. She didn't cry. She hadn't, not since her first solo flight years ago, when a man laughed at her French pronunciation and said, "You people always try to sound smarter than you are." But this wasn't about one comment, or one passenger, or even Carson. It was the pattern, the slow erosion of dignity, the way her excellence made others uncomfortable. She took a breath. Do your work. Stay calm. Let your performance speak. That was what her grandmother always said. Still, sometimes silence felt like surrender, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stay quiet. Back in first class, Elaine Voss scrolled her tablet, but her fingers were tense. Her mind replayed Imani's words, calm but cutting. She shifted in her seat and rang the call bell again. This time, Lena responded. Elaine frowned. Where's the other one? The language girl. Lena smiled tightly. Ms. Reeves is on break. Elaine sniffed. Figures. Probably can't handle the pressure. Lena's tone didn't change. She's handling it just fine. Would you like water? Or something else? Elaine didn't answer, but the unspoken message landed clearly. In the cockpit, Ethan stood to leave. I'll expect your official report on this crew within 48 hours, and I'd strongly advise you not to sweep this under the rug. Rowan exhaled. Yes, sir. Ethan paused. And one more thing. Rowan met his gaze. There will be changes. Starting today, as Ethan walked back to his seat, passengers glanced at him with subtle recognition. Word was spreading. One man leaned over to his wife. Isn't that the guy from the business section last month, Astra VIA's new CEO? She whispered back. I think so. In 34A. Ethan sat down again and stared out the window. Below, the ocean gleamed. Above, the sky remained steady. But inside the cabin, the balance was shifting. The old order had been disturbed, and in the quiet hum of altitude, truth had begun to find its voice. The cabin had shifted. It wasn't obvious, not yet, but there was a subtle ripple in the air like a pressure change before a storm. Imani felt it first. As she emerged from the galley, refreshed but still carrying the invisible weight of microaggressions, she noticed the looks, not the usual curious glances, but something else. Reverence, sympathy, and curiosity. Passengers were whispering, smiling. One even offered her a polite, almost apologetic nod. Something had changed, and she had no idea what. In row 10, a college student named Marisol tapped away at her phone. The in-flight Wi-Fi was slow, but she had enough bars to post the tweet. Flight attendant just handled a situation in German after speaking Portuguese earlier. Found out she speaks 9 languages. Meanwhile, another Hefe tried to shade her. Sis held her head like a queen. Josh, Flight AV-197. I respect, where it's due. Within 10 minutes, It had 400 retweets. By 20, it was trending in the travel community. Meanwhile, Carson caught the buzz too late. She passed row 10 and overheard Marisol showing the tweet to a fellow passenger. "Who posted this?" Carson asked sharply, pausing. Marisol looked up, confused. I did." Carson gave a tight smile. "It's against airline policy to film or document crew behavior without consent." Marisol shrugged. "I didn't record anything. I just tweeted what I saw." Carson's jaw flexed. "Well, it's important to maintain professionalism in public commentary," she said curtly. Before turning, Marisol narrowed her eyes. "You should try it sometime." Up in the cockpit, Captain Hale stared at his tablet. The crew's internal messaging channel had lit up. One post stood out from Ethan Cole himself, sent directly to flight operations and marked "Urgent evaluate current cabin leadership effectiveness. Initiate culture review for frontline crew. Schedule listening sessions with in-flight staff across international routes." Hale shook his head. He had flown across continents and through lightning storms, but never had a single passenger altered the flight's dynamics like this. Except Ethan Cole wasn't just a passenger. He was a storm in a suit. Later, Imani was restocking the beverage cart when she heard the voice behind her. "Ms. Reeves." She turned. A man in his mid-40s stood there, suit slightly wrinkled from the long flight, face open and earnest. "I just wanted to thank you. My parents are in row 16, the German couple. They told me what happened earlier, said they haven't felt that scene in years." Imani's brows lifted slightly. He continued, "My mom had a stroke last year, struggles with her English now. It's frustrating for her, but the way you spoke to them, she cried after you walked away. Happy tears." Imani's throat tightened. She swallowed. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. He smiled, eyes kind. The world doesn't always reward grace, but some of us see it. In the galley, Carson stood frozen, listening. She had caught just enough of the exchange to feel it like a bruise. Grace, that word again. She looked down at her perfectly arranged trays, her certifications, her tenure. She had paid her dues. So why was she suddenly invisible? Why did it feel like this woman younger, darker, quieter, was casting a longer shadow than her entire career? And worse, why was she starting to believe it was justified? Back in 34A, Ethan watched the cabin buzz. The energy had shifted, not by command, not by memo, but by truth. He opened his notes app and typed, "Leadership isn't just who wears the badge, it's who earns the trust when no one's watching." He paused, then added, "Recommend Imani Reeves frontline culture trainer, global language lead, promo track international director candidate." He saved the note. Then, with a quiet sigh, he closed his eyes and let the hum of altitude carry him forward. The turbulence wasn't just outside the aircraft, now it had moved into the aisles. Something unseen was rising. Passengers could feel it, crew members could taste it, and for Imani Reeves, it was just a matter of time before it broke. Carson Lee's knuckles whitened around a clipboard. She had really tried to maintain her cool, but the whispers, the glances, and now the praise flooding toward Imani. It was too much, too fast. She's hijacking this flight without even raising her voice, Carson thought. She marched to the galley and pulled Lena aside. "Listen, I need your help." Lena blinked. "With what?" "With reminding our passengers who's actually running this flight." Lena shifted uncomfortably. "Carson, Imani hasn't broken protocol. She's made me look like a joke." Carson snapped in a hushed tone. Do you know what that does to a career like mine? I've logged 15,000 hours. Then why does she scare you so much? Lena whispered. Carson froze. That question, too direct, too honest, landed like a slap. She didn't answer. Meanwhile, in row 7, a young girl tugged at Imani's uniform. Hi, she said shyly. My mom says you're the best flight lady ever. Imani knelt beside her. Is that so? The girl nodded and grinned. I want to be just like you. I'm learning French. Imani chuckled gently. Bonjour, mademoiselle. The girl giggled and repeated it. From 2 rows back, a man lowered his newspaper and watched. His lips curled into a small smile. Ethan Cole had seen 1,000 employees in 1,000 countries. But only a few ever made an impression like this. Then it happened. The PA crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Rowan Hale's voice announced, we're beginning our descent into Lisbon. Please return to your seats and ensure all carry-on items are stowed. As passengers shifted, Carson moved quickly. She walked toward first class and loudly began offering one last round of beverages, but deliberately skipped over Imani's section. Then she made a calculated mistake. Stopping at row 1, she smiled at Elaine Voss and, within earshot of others, said, I apologize for the confusion earlier. We'll make sure your section receives better service next time. Imani, just steps away, heard it. So did Marisol. So did Ethan. Elaine looked satisfied. But before she could respond, Ethan slowly stood. Ms. Lee, he said, his voice calm but cutting. I believe that's enough. Carson turned to him, confused. Excuse me, you've undermined your colleague in front of multiple passengers. Again. Her smile faltered. I'm simply ensuring first-class expectations are met. No, Ethan said, stepping into the aisle. You're retaliating, because someone else did their job better than you were willing to. Gasps fluttered through nearby seats. Elaine leaned back as if burned. Carson stammered. I don't even know who you are to be speaking to me this way. Ethan pulled out his lanyard slowly, revealing his ID. Ethan Cole, Chief Executive Officer, Astra VI International. The entire cabin went still. Captain Hale appeared moments later, summoned by the purser. He looked from Ethan to Carson, then to Imani, who stood quietly, hands folded, watching it all with the same grace that had built this storm in the first place. Captain, Ethan said without turning, I'm placing a formal leadership override. Yes, sir. I expect Ms. Reeves to receive a commendation in her flight record before we land. Yes, sir, and Ms. Lee will not be flying return with this crew. The words hung in the air. Carson's lips parted. You can't, I can, Ethan said, his voice almost gentle now, because I listen before I act. You might want to try it. As Carson was quietly escorted to the back for debrief, the silence in the cabin deepened. Imani didn't move. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled. Passengers began to clap. It started with a few, then grew into full applause. But Imani held her ground. She looked at Ethan, eyes steady, and for a moment they simply nodded to each other. Respect, earned, not demanded. The applause had faded. The engines hummed in their usual rhythm. The captain had returned to the cockpit. The passengers settled back into their seats, unaware that a quiet storm had just passed through the heart of the cabin. But inside Imani Reeves, a deeper unrest was just beginning. She stood alone in the aft galley, away from the others, The compliments, the clapping, the way passengers had smiled at her after the confrontation it all felt. Hollow now, temporary, like praise that vanished the moment the plane touched ground. She should have felt proud. Instead, she felt exposed, like she'd survived something that no one else would remember by next Tuesday. Lena appeared quietly beside her. "You okay?" Imani nodded automatically, but her voice betrayed her. "Why do I have to fight, just to do my job?" Lena didn't answer right away. She leaned against the panel, hands clasped. "Because you do it too well," she finally said, "and that scares people." Imani let out a tired laugh, the kind that comes from recognizing a bitter truth. "I never signed up to be anyone's example," she whispered. "You didn't have to." Lena replied, "You became one anyway, up in first class." Ethan sat staring at the window. He saw nothing but clouds, yet his mind was racing. He thought of his own mother, who worked 2 jobs and taught him Swahili between night shifts. Thought of the first time he sat in a boardroom and realized he was the only one who looked like him. He hadn't stood up today because of ego. He'd stood up because silence was no longer an option. And yet, had he done it for the right reasons, or had it been too public? Too sudden, he made a mental note to schedule a private debrief with Imani after landing. She deserved more than a viral moment. She deserved a seat at the table, not a pedestal. In row 12, Marisol scrolled through her feed. Her tweet had exploded. Interviews, DMs from media outlets, requests to tag Imani's full name. She hesitated. Was she helping amplify a hero or putting a target on her back? She looked up at Imani standing at the rear, her posture still graceful despite everything. No cameras, no filter, just dignity. Marisol decided. No name drop, not yet. Let the story live on its own first. Carson sat in the crew jump seat, staring ahead blankly. She'd made the call, said the words, and now she was being escorted off the return leg, reassigned pending investigation. Her voice, the voice that used to command attention, was now just a muffled echo behind her resentment. And worse, she had started to believe Imani deserved the praise. That's what haunted her most. As the plane descended into golden dusk over Portugal, the clouds began to part. Passengers shifted in their seats. Flight attendants began preparing for arrival. But Imani stood still for a moment longer, breathing slowly. She thought of all the languages she'd spoken today: Portuguese, French, German, English, each one a key to unlock something in someone else. She didn't feel powerful. She felt tired and quietly determined. The real work wasn't the languages. It wasn't the applause. It was in what happened next when the flight ended and the world resumed its noise, and whether she would still be heard. The landing gear thudded into place. Imani felt it in her chest like a punctuation mark. This flight was over, but she knew deep down that her story wasn't. The wheels touched down in Lisbon, a smooth landing, a typical moment, except nothing about this arrival was typical. From her jump seat, Imani looked out the tiny port window. She saw 3 things. 1, a clean runway. 2, airport staff waiting with baggage carts. And 3, a small press group, already forming near Gate 14. She blinked. Had news traveled that fast? As the plane taxied, the cabin buzzed with new energy. Passengers glanced at their phones, whispering. Marisol sat frozen. Her tweet now had over 1.3 million likes. Some people clapped again. Some took photos. Others stared curiously at Imani as if she were a museum exhibit that had come to life mid-flight. She hated that part. The spectacle. This wasn't a show, it was her job. And today, someone had just let her do it. In first class, Ethan Cole stood, checked his blazer, and moved toward the rear. As passengers began gathering bags overhead, he tapped Imani gently on the shoulder. "Can we talk privately?" Imani hesitated, then nodded. He gestured toward the crew prep area. Out of view, neutral ground. Inside the galley, Ethan leaned against a cabinet, not with arrogance but with humility. "I owe you a proper apology," he said. Imani folded her arms. "You already did more than most CEOs would. That doesn't make it enough." She studied him. "You stood up for me, publicly." Why, he took a breath. "My mother spoke 6 languages," he said, "but she never got promoted beyond gate duty." Imani blinked. She was told she was too much for customers, too confident, too brown. Silence. "So when I heard you speaking like that today, when I saw what you did with that boy in Portuguese, with that elderly couple in German, I realized something." He looked her in the eyes. "I wasn't just watching an excellent flight attendant. I was watching the kind of leader we need more of. Someone who sees people." Imani didn't speak at first. Her walls were still high, but her voice was soft when it came. "And what happens now, I go viral." Then fade. Ethan shook his head. "You deserve more than applause. You deserve influence." He reached into his blazer and pulled out a business card. Backside handwritten note. "Let's talk. Not PR. Policy. EC. You want change," he said. "Help me build it." She stared at the card, then back at him. There was no smile, but something in her eyes softened. She didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away, and Ethan took that as a start. Outside the plane, the terminal had erupted. A few journalists had managed to catch names. Stories were flying faster than the luggage off Carousel 3. One headline read, "Black flight attendant silences plane with 9 languages passenger. Says it's the most human experience he's had in 30 years. Another CEO confronts his own airline on flight to Lisbon and may have just changed the game. Back in the terminal, Carson Lee was being met by HR representatives. Her face was pale. She didn't look defiant anymore, just quiet. For the first time, she would have to explain herself to someone in power. As Imani stepped off flight AV-197, she held her head high. Not because the world suddenly loved her, not because of headlines, and certainly not because she wanted fame, but because for the first time in her career her full self had walked off that plane. Imani Reeves walked past the gate, not briskly, not nervously, deliberately. She felt every pair of eyes that turned to her whispers, glances, half-hushed gasps from travelers recognizing her face from phone screens and flight gossip, but she didn't stop, didn't smile, didn't wave. She wasn't anyone's moment. She was a woman on her way to make a choice. The offer still burned in her pocket. Ethan Cole's card tucked against her phone. A handwritten message, no branding, no pressure, just let's talk. Not PR. Policy. It had been 20 minutes since they landed, 30 minutes since the plane fell quiet. 5 years since she'd felt like she could speak and someone really would listen. Now, she was on her way to Gate 22, not for departure, but for a meeting she never expected. Inside the private conference lounge, Ethan sat alone with 2 coffees on the table. No assistants, no PR reps, just him. He stood when she walked in, "Hope you don't mind the quiet," he said. Imani offered a tired smirk. "After today, silence is a gift." They sat. A moment passed. Then Ethan folded his hands. "Before you say anything," he began, "I want to be clear. I'm not here to sell you anything, or parade you around as a symbol." Imani raised an eyebrow. He leaned forward. "I'm here to listen." And so, for the next 45 minutes, she told him everything. About training new hires who were promoted over her, about Carson, about the time she de-escalated a violent passenger with French and Korean in the same breath and was reprimanded for overstepping her role. She told him about how she woke up at 3:45 a.m. to review Portuguese verb forms, so a family wouldn't feel ignored in their grief, about how she memorized cultural norms for Nigerian travelers, German businessmen, Moroccan elders. She told him not because she wanted a reward, but because she had never said it out loud. Ethan didn't interrupt once. Finally, she exhaled. The quiet returned. Ethan set down his coffee. "Cold now. I want to offer you something," he said. She sat still. "You can keep flying, or—" He slid a tablet across the table. "A draft policy document. Help me build the next generation of crew development, language bonuses, cultural fluency recognition, equity leadership from within." She stared at the screen. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't finished, but it was real. "You want me off the plane?" she asked. "I want you where your voice travels further than the aisle," he replied. Silence again, but not awkward, reflective. "I've loved this job," Imani said softly, "even when it didn't love me back." Ethan nodded. "Then maybe it's time to make it love people like you better." She didn't smile. Not yet. But something in her posture straightened like a tether had loosened. "I'll think about it," she said. Ethan stood. "That's all I ask." As she left the lounge, something unexpected caught her eye. A small girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood near the window watching planes take off. Her mother stood beside her, gently pointing and naming the countries on a screen. Imani passed them and heard the little girl say in near-perfect Spanish, "Mamá, ¿crees que yo también puedo volar algún día? Do you think I can fly one day too?" Imani paused, turned, and answered, softly but clearly, in Spanish, "Yes, baby girl, you already are." It started as a quiet choice. Imani Reeves didn't make a public statement. She didn't post. She didn't pose. She didn't even tell most of her friends. She just accepted. The call came 3 days after Lisbon. A simple onboarding packet, a single email with the subject line, "Welcome to the Equity and Crew Development Team." She clicked reply, typed just one word, "ready," and everything changed. Word spread faster than she expected. The crew was the first to notice, especially Lena. When Imani didn't show up on Flight 232 to Montreal, Lena asked around. Rumors buzzed. Did she quit? Is she suing? Was she fired? And then she's working with Ethan Cole now. It didn't take long before the whispers turned to something else entirely: hope. The internal memo hit inboxes the next morning. Astra VIA Airlines was launching a new initiative, the Cultural Fluency and Fair Promotion Directive. A mouthful. But it meant something very simple. Multilingual staff would be recognized. Cultural competency would carry weight. And promotions wouldn't just favor seniority or old networks. The kicker, a former flight attendant, not a consultant, would lead it. Her name was Imani Reeves. The announcement broke the internet again. BuzzFeed ran, "She spoke 9 languages. Now she's rewriting airline history." Business Insider called her the quiet storm shaking up corporate skies. But Imani stayed grounded. She still took the subway, still made her own lunch, still whispered words of encouragement to new crew hires she passed in the lobby. "You'll be fine," she told one fresh-faced recruit. "Just don't shrink for anyone." Meanwhile, back in first-class cabins around the world, things started to shift. Small things, at first. Crew began receiving flashcards with greetings in multiple languages. Supervisors now tracked how often attendants mediated cross-cultural misunderstandings. Passengers could leave comments in their native tongue, and the airline actually responded. And one by one, staff members began to feel it. They weren't just uniforms. They were human again. But not everyone was happy. Carson Lee, quietly reassigned to an admin role in scheduling, called it performative politics. In private, she scoffed. "So now we need to be Google Translate to get promoted." But even she noticed something in the break room. Crew members, ones she used to barely acknowledge, now held their heads higher. They smiled when they spoke their mother tongues. They didn't ask for permission to be brilliant anymore. They simply were. At a crew town hall 2 weeks later, Imani finally spoke publicly. She didn't use a stage, no teleprompter. She stood in the center aisle of a training room in Queens, and she said, "When I spoke 9 languages on that flight, it wasn't to show off. It was survival. It was connection. And now, we're building an airline that doesn't just fly over people, we understand them." The room stood still. Some clapped, some cried, but one voice, a whisper from the back, asked, "Did you ever think this would happen?" Imani smiled gently. "No," she said. "I just knew it had to." And far away on a different flight, somewhere over the Atlantic, a junior attendant greeted a frightened passenger in Turkish. The man looked up in surprise, his eyes wide. How did you know?" She smiled. "I trained under someone who reminded me why it matters." He reached for her hand and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't need a headline. That was her ripple. The gate agent's voice buzzed over the intercom. "Now boarding flight AV312 to Accra, Ghana." Imani Reeves stood at the edge of the gate, clipboard in hand, not in uniform anymore, but wearing Astra VIA's new Navy blazer with the small gold pin, Equity and Crew Dev. She wasn't flying today. She was observing, mentoring, and saying goodbye. Today was her last on-board day. After this, she'd be full-time in policy development, her office 2 floors above corporate. But her heart, still somewhere between gate B14 and 36,000 feet. The boarding process was smooth. The new attendants greeted passengers in their native languages, some hesitant, some fluent. Imani beamed silently when Lena, now a lead attendant, welcomed a woman in Wolof. As the final passengers boarded, a slow-moving elderly man stepped forward, tall, dressed in a pressed white shirt, a walking cane in one hand, and a worn leather bag in the other. He looked confused, overwhelmed. The gate agent glanced at Imani. "He doesn't speak English." Imani stepped forward, crouched slightly. "Bonjour," she tried softly. He blinked, no response. Espanol, Deutsch, nothing. She tried again. Caro, in Yoruba, salam, in Arabic. Still, silence. The old man looked at her and gently placed his hand over his heart, then pointed to the sky. Imani's breath caught, not at the gesture, but at the feeling. The way he looked at her as if he already understood her, without words, and she realized this wasn't a test. This wasn't about language. It was about presence. She smiled and offered her arm. He took it, together. They stepped onto the jet bridge, no translation needed. Back in the terminal, she sat by the window, watching the aircraft push back from the gate. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan Board Vote passed. You're officially VP of Cultural Inclusion, first exec of your kind in our company. Let's celebrate next week. She stared at the message, blinking slowly. It wasn't the title. It wasn't the seat at the table. It was that someone finally made room. Later that week, Imani gave one final speech, this time to a room full of new recruits. They stood shoulder to shoulder, nervous, diverse, eager. She paused before speaking, then leaned on the podium and simply said, "You don't need 9 languages to be worthy. You don't need to save the day to be seen. You just need to show up fully. Speak with heart, even if your words shake, and never let someone convince you your brilliance is too much." A beat of silence, then applause. Not the loud kind, the kind that matters. Weeks passed, months, and Imani settled into her new role, crafting policy, rewriting manuals, pushing back on old narratives. But every so often, she still walked the gates, still helped crew members pronounce Amharic greetings, still stopped when a child stared at her and asked, "Are you the lady who speaks everything?" She'd kneel down and say, "Not everything, sweetheart," just enough to make people feel like they belong. Then, one day, while boarding a routine flight from D.C. to São Paulo, a junior attendant welcomed a Brazilian family in fluent Portuguese. The mother blinked, then cried, right there in the aisle. "I haven't heard my language spoken kindly since I left home," she whispered. The attendant smiled and said, "That's why I joined. I read about someone named Imani Reeves." In a quiet office, years later, a framed letter sat on Imani's desk, written in handwritten French, from a retired passenger who once couldn't speak to anyone at 35,000 feet until a certain flight attendant tried 8 languages to find the right one. Below the note were 6 simple words. You spoke. The world listened. Merci. Imani touched the frame, then returned to her work. Not for the applause, but for every person who ever sat in silence and finally heard themselves in someone else's voice. She didn't ask for praise. She just wanted to speak and be respected. Imani Reeves's story reminds us that true leadership doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it walks the aisles with calm eyes, fluent words, and a heart that listens before it speaks. And yet, her journey also reveals a harsher truth. How many voices have been dismissed simply because of skin color, accent, or where they were seated? It takes courage to speak 9 languages, but it takes even more to speak up when the world tells you to stay quiet. We hope Imani's story left you thinking, feeling, and maybe even reimagining what equity looks like at 36,000 feet, or right here on the ground. Let's not stay silent when we witness injustice. Let's lift up those who've been overlooked. And above all, let's remember that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter their uniform or language. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to our channel, because the next story might just be the one that changes everything. Until then, fly with kindness. See you in the next video.